Now we'll turn to Southeast Asia and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative Director at CSIS, Gregory B, to discuss China's tactics in the South China Sea, the maritime militia, China's military capabilities in the region, and the implications of China's militarization of artificial islands in contested waters. Gregory, it's great to have you on today. Thanks for joining the CDAI. In the context of recent incidents involving the Philippines and growing tensions, how are regional dynamics and the balance of power in the South China Sea evolving, and what potential scenarios should be considered for the future?
At the moment, there are two places in the South China Sea that worry me, and I think are certainly worrying the U.S. government. One of those is the now monthly China-Philippines standoff around a feature called Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines maintains a small outpost aboard an old World War II era ship that's been intentionally ground on the reef since 1999. And the other is in the air above the South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, where we've seen a growing frequency of unsafe air intercepts. In the first case, China seems determined to block Philippine resupply missions to this ship, and the Philippines is determined to run that blockade, which is how you get increasingly unsafe interactions, including the collisions that happened early this month. In the latter case, according to the US DoD, we've seen almost 300 unsafe Chinese intercepts of US or allied aircraft over the last 2 years, about one every 2.5 days. That's included Australian and Canadian aircraft, most recently a couple weeks ago when a PLA jet almost collided with a Canadian jet over the East China Sea. And just this week, when reportedly a Chinese jet came within 10 feet of a US B-52, which is insanely dangerous.
What is the significance of recent incidents such as the ship collision in the South China Sea? And can you describe their relationship to China's maritime ambitions, maybe touching on how they fit in with the concept of gray zones?
So China has spent the last 10 years under Xi Jinping's leadership growing ever more assertive when it comes to what might be called the rights protection mission. The idea that in the South China Sea in particular, there are islands that were taken from China during the century of humiliation. That's all fiction, but that doesn't really matter. It has become the motivating factor behind this effort to impose China's will on its smaller neighbors, using primarily non-military means. So Coast Guard, maritime militia, and other state-owned or state-directed actors who stay just below the traditional threshold for military force, which makes it very difficult for states to know how to respond. That has been wildly successful for China over the last 10 years, steadily eating away at the ability of other states to control their own waters, their own resources. But now China seems to have hit a wall because the disputes have boiled down to just a couple of discrete locations, such as Second Thomas Shoal. And when the other party is willing to stand firm, as the Philippines is, gray zone no longer works. Gray zone only works if you can bully the other party into backing down. Instead, what we have now is just this regular monthly kind of ineffectual operation that increases the risk of accidental collision and escalation. And if there was an escalation around Second Thomas Shoal that caused a loss of life to a Filipino sailor, it's very easy to imagine the Philippines invoking the Article 4 commitments in the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, and then the U.S. getting involved militarily. Even worse would be if we had a collision in the air, another EP-3 incident, for instance, like the 2001 incident in which a Chinese fighter jet collided with a U.S. EP-3 surveillance aircraft, leading to the loss of life of the Chinese pilot in a weeks-long standoff. That was at a time when we had much, much better crisis communication mechanisms than we do today. It's very easy for me to imagine a air-to-air collision that we wake up to tomorrow, and the U.S. government can't even get the Chinese government on the phone for weeks until the spiral has already taken effect, and we find ourselves in a really deep freeze that it's hard to get out of.
What are the main military capabilities and facilities that China has deployed on its artificial island bases, and how do they contribute to China's ability to dominate the South China Sea in the early stage of a potential conflict?
So China spent the period from December 2013 until about mid-2016 building up its artificial island bases in the Spratlys. There was virtually no dry land there before. Now there's over 3,000 acres. Added a couple hundred more up in the Paracel Islands to the north. China now has 4 pretty sophisticated air and naval bases in the Spratly Islands. I'm sorry, in the South China Sea. 3 in the Spratlys, 1 in the Paracels. The most important thing that's done is it has allowed China to forward deploy dozens of Coast Guard vessels and hundreds of maritime militia vessels, which are state-owned actors in most cases, or at least state-directed, who pretend to be fishermen in order to hide their intentions and make attribution impossible. They now have all of these forward deployed in the Spratly Islands, 800 miles south of the Chinese mainland. And that means that in many cases, Chinese patrol vessels are closer to, say, Philippine fishing grounds or Malaysian or Vietnamese oil and gas fields than those Southeast Asian countries are themselves. It's created the ability for China to maintain a presence 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the basis of this gray zone strategy that has successfully pushed Southeast Asians out of their own waters over the last 10 years. And frankly, that matters far more than what the islands could mean in a conflict. In a conflict, they would be highly complicated. Not so much because of the strike capabilities on them. They all do have anti-ship cruise missiles and surface-to-air missiles, but a single Chinese destroyer has more firepower than all these islands combined. What really matters is that the islands are bristling with sensing and radar and communications equipment. So it guarantees that China has persistent ISR surveillance ability over the entire South China Sea, and nobody else does. So it's almost impossible to imagine U.S. vessels or aircraft operating without being immediately identified. Plus, the runways on the islands allow China to maintain a persistent aerial patrol. So China really now dominates the South China Sea in a hypothetical conflict in a way it didn't before. But I think the key thing to remember is that the PLA has no intention to fight the U.S. Seventh Fleet over the South China Sea. China intends to win that without fighting through gray zone, and it's been pretty successful in doing that. The militia is not we're not taking poetic license here. These are not just fishermen who are hyped up on nationalism and get in trouble. These are an arm of the Chinese state. Under China's 1982 military service law, young men who leave active duty military service, which is compulsory, are required to enroll in the militia. China has operated a maritime militia, which is basically just the young men who happen to be from fishing villages in the South China Sea since at least the 1970s. They were heavily involved, for instance, in the seizure of the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam in 1975. What's changed is that since 2012 or 13, the state has begun to put a lot more resourcing behind these militia to modernize them. In 2012, you had the infamous standoff at Scarborough Shoal, in which China effectively seized control of that feature from the Philippines. That was provoked by maritime militia units from a village called Tanmen in Hainan. In the wake of that operation, Xi Jinping, newly elevated to president and head of the China Military Commission, Central Military Commission, went down to Tanmen with reporters in tow and on national TV thanked the Tanmen militia for their service and said that other militia across the nation should model themselves on the Tanmen militia. And since then, you can see an explosion in the numbers, in the size, and in the sophistication of the militia. Today, China operates probably something like 150 to 200 professional maritime militia vessels in the South China Sea. These are all owned and operated by a state-owned company called the Sansha Fisheries Development Company, and they're nominally registered to the Paracel Islands, although they mainly operate out of Hainan. In addition, you have several hundred more pseudo-civilian vessels. These are what in Chinese documents are not called militia, they're called the Spratly Backbone Fishing Fleet, and they're basically subsidized to go down to the Spratly Islands and lie at anchor for the better part of a year. They don't fish, but they show the Chinese flag. That latter component is very annoying to the Philippines and to Vietnam, but it's not necessarily an immediate problem. The professional militia are. These are the ones that are contesting Philippine resupply missions around Second Thomas Shoal. They're harassing oil and gas operations across the South China Sea. They're harassing U.S. freedom of navigation operations and so on. And I think legally and operationally, if they present the risk of collision or risk to the safety or lives of foreign mariners, they'll be treated as armed combatants, whether China realizes it or not.
Can you dive a bit into the historical events and some of the factors that have contributed to the current state of tensions in the South China Sea, perhaps touching on some of the key territorial claims in the region and some of the disputes involved?
Yeah, so the South China Sea disputes are, at this point, more than a century old. But the current status of the disputes is really the post-World War II history of the disputes, which is Primarily a territorial dispute until the 1990s. Nobody was claiming water and seabed and airspace. That would have been ludicrous, historically. You had the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China both claiming all of these islands, the Paracel Islands, which are in the north of the South China Sea, and the Spratly Islands in the south, plus a bunch of other stuff, including Scarborough Shoal, which is a small rock off the coast of Luzon, the main Philippine island. After World War II, really dating back to the 1930s, the Philippines also claimed a big chunk of the Spratlys, as well as Scarborough Shoal, which had been administered by the Philippines when it was a U.S. territory. Malaysia jumped in later in the game, claiming those islands and reefs that would lie on its continental shelf under international law. And even Brunei claims those that would lie on its continental shelf. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped the other big one, Vietnam. Vietnam claims all of the Paracels and all of the Spratlys, much like China. Although, to Vietnam's credit, it at least only claims the actual islands. China claims a lot of underwater stuff. None of that really mattered if you were outside of Southeast Asia. That wasn't a pressing issue for the US or the Europeans or the Japanese. All we really cared about was that nobody used force to resolve those territorial disputes. The disputes began to expand and change in the 1990s when China decided that it no longer only claimed the islands, but instead also claimed what it now calls historic rights to all of the waters, all of the seabed, and all of the airspace of the South China Sea in direct violation of international law. And that directly infringes on the rights of third parties, including the United States. That's what brought the US more directly into the disputes. In 2009, China submitted that claim formally to a UN body. And then for the last 10 years under Xi Jinping's leadership, we've seen China really throwing its weight around to try to enforce those claims that had existed on paper for decades.
I'd like to touch on cross-strait relations for a moment. What broader implications do China's territorial claims have for Taiwan?
Well, there's a few ways that these interact. One, the claims that China, meaning the government in Beijing, currently makes are ultimately ROC claims. They were first put out there by the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. Now, at the time, Chiang Kai-shek's government drew a dotted line, the infamous now 9-dash line in China or U-shaped line in Taiwan, as a cartographic shorthand because they didn't know where all the islands were. They didn't have a navy or a survey fleet. So they just said, we claim all the islands inside this line. China has taken that and run with it and now developed this much more expansive claim to waters and seabed. The ROC does not claim waters and seabed like China. So it is inaccurate to say that Taiwan's claim is identical to China's. It's really not. But it does put Taiwan in an awkward position. It's the Taiwanese government doesn't want to abandon its claims historically because that would be politically damaging, but it also doesn't really want to feed into this Chinese narrative. So for the most part, it just keeps quiet. Taiwan does, however, continue to occupy two islands. Taiwan occupies Ituaba, which is the largest of the islands in the Spratlys, about half a square mile. And it's been there since 1956, originally occupied in 1947. It also occupies a feature called Pratas Reef, which is up in the very north of the South China Sea. It's not claimed by anybody except China or Taiwan, basically right at the mouth of the Bashi Channel that leads into the Taiwan Strait. And it is occupied by Taiwanese forces. So one area where you could imagine these interacting is that as China seeks to squeeze Taiwan, turn the screws on Taiwan without provoking military intervention from the US or anybody else, two obvious targets would be Pratas or Ituaba, where China could engage in a short, sharp military escalation, probably without provoking foreign intervention. I'd also note that a lot of the same gray zone tactics that we see employed in the South China Sea are employed in the Taiwan Strait, involving China's Coast Guard, China's aerial patrols. We also see this in the East China Sea. Kind of across the board, what China tries to do is use its quantitative advantages to wear down states with which it has disputes. This is one of the reasons that the Taiwanese Air Force has stopped scrambling in response to Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace because they simply can't keep up. And that's the point. China knows that it's grinding down Taiwanese readiness by doing this.
Gregory, thanks for coming on the show. Great to have you on.